Australia, the land of stunning beaches, outrageously good coffee, and enough venomous creatures to keep life interesting. It's a place where the dream used to be simple: work hard, buy a house, and maybe wrestle a crocodile for good measure. But these days, you save, you're ready, and then show up to a rental inspection, only to realise it's less an inspection and more like auditioning for the Hunger Games. As you stand in that endless queue of hopefuls, one question nags at you: why does it feel like the entire world just moved here overnight? Well, that's because they have. And any attempt to talk about it gets swiftly shut down with the usual accusations: racism, xenophobia, and other buzzwords, all at the expense of the working class and young people.
Skivity.
Luckily for me, I am immune to those buzzwords. Why? Because ironically, I'm a permanently brown first-generation immigrant myself. Judging by the accent, you could probably guess I've been here for a while. And let me tell you, Australia has changed a lot in that time. And in the past few years, things haven't gone too well. Now, whether you're Australian or watching from elsewhere, let me paint you a picture to demonstrate this. Since 2019, Australia has experienced the largest decline in living standards in the developed world. According to the OECD, real hourly wages have fallen by 4.8% and real disposable income is down by 2%. Compare that to countries like the United States, where disposable incomes rose by 9.3%, or the OECD average increase of 7.7%. While much of the developed world has moved forward, Australia is sliding backward. Australia is in fact in a per capita recession right now. Food, housing, energy and taxes have gone up. In Sydney, the average person would have to save for almost 50 years, roll the drums, to afford the deposit required to get a mortgage. That's almost double what it was in 2012. But the Mayans didn't predict that. Now, we would all be laughing if the situation wasn't so tragic. But no, this is as funny as Australian woke comedians.
Dad's Google history.
Home ownership rates have, as a result, virtually collapsed in Australia for 24 to 35-year-olds. Unless you bought a house in the 1960s for magic beans, or you just flew down from Beijing to launder cash, you can no longer own a house in Australia. Alright, so you can't buy a house because of avocado toast and takeaway soy caramel lattes.
One of the vanilla bull things, whatever you want, some vanilla bull latte kappa thing, whatever you got.
But you can rent, right? Wrong. Take a look at this insane graph, which shows you the massive jump in rents for houses and units in capital cities. I've seen this firsthand amongst my social circle. Every year, landlords asking for over $100 increases on already record rents. And they do so because the vacancy rates for rentals are also at historical lows, while the demand is skyrocketing. So, as your money loses value, most of your income is swallowed up by housing and energy costs, and the standard of living has all but collapsed, something has seen a rather big increase. Corporations, the political and academic elite are quite happy about this too. And jokes on you because it's almost certainly not your wages. Peasant, it's the sheer number of immigrants, mostly in the form of international students, who have poured into Australia. Australia's population has seen record growth in the past few years. And it's not because of more babies, no. In 2023, the population increased by around 650,000 people, some of the highest annual growth since the 1950s. To put this into context, this is bigger than the total populations of Canberra, Hobart and Darwin combined. In just 1 year, Australia added the equivalent of 3 capital cities' populations to its already overstretched infrastructure, housing and public services. A substantial portion of this increase is international students. In 2024, there's almost 1 million international students in Australia. Out of over 6 million total international students globally, this means Australia currently takes in almost 15%. That is insanity, especially considering Australia doesn't have a population as big as the US, UK, or Canada. Now, because of past mismanagement where Australia doesn't benefit from being one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, education exports have apparently become a money printer. Well, obviously not for the average person. In truth, the benefits of this sector in recent years is nothing but a facade, one that is driving a billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. First up, there's this propaganda that permeates Australian politics, especially the left wing, that unfettered immigration, especially from international students, has no negatives. Apparently, They're all high quality, highly skilled individuals who seemingly exist in a magic vacuum that requires no additional healthcare, infrastructure, and other social services. This is pure fantasy. Remember that previous rental price graph I brought up earlier? Now, let's overlay that with the temporary visa holders in Australia. Almost a perfect match. It is clear as day that these students add significant demand for rental housing. A fact sheet from the Department of Education found that international students utilise 7% of Australia's rental accommodation, or 1 in every 14 rental homes. This graph demonstrates that demand quite clearly. Unfortunately, supply cannot keep up. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, despite having the 4th highest rate of home building in the developed world, Australia still cannot keep up with the soaring demand. There are a number of reasons for the hampered supply side of the housing market. One, the obvious increase in construction costs following the pandemic. The other are structurally higher interest rates. In fact, experts believe interest rates should be a lot higher, but this would destroy the housing market. So, the Reserve Bank won't do so. In fact, recently, the governor of the Reserve Bank revealed that 75,000 more people would need to be out of work for interest rates to fall. Which is why one of the best resources I use to research news, like for this video, is Ground News, an app and website that compiles thousands of news articles into one place to give you the complete picture. They become invaluable and make it easy to see how different media sources frame the same events. Take this article on the Reserve Bank's comments around interest rates in Australia. There are 9 sources covering this topic, with over 65% of these sources being right-leaning. Looking at the different headlines, we see that some right-leaning sources highlight Australia's economy in comparison to peer economies, while left-leaning sources focus more on unemployment. Being able to see all this information in one place helps us compare the narratives that are being pushed. Another feature I love is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that the left or right might be overlooking. It's especially helpful if you want a full understanding of the issues beyond what you see on social media. I have been a user for years now, and I genuinely think you'll love their platform as well, which you can check out at ground.news/dingo. Go check them out at ground.news/dingo or scan the QR code on screen to get started. You can join for less than $1 a month, or use my link in the description to get 50% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year, and it will only be available for a limited time. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Let's jump back in. Now, what exactly are these international students actually contributing to Australia? Mind you, I don't think having a reasonable number of genuine international students is a bad thing, but 1 million, putting significant pressure on critical infrastructure and services during a per capita recession, is pretty bad. And similar to our counterparts in Canada, for which I actually did a similar video you can check out here, Australia, if I'm being completely frank, now has an India problem. India is not only flexing its political muscle, but is now Australia's largest source of migrants, most of whom arrive through the student visa route. This route, unfortunately, has been utterly rorted. India is also Australia's largest source of permanent migration. And because they are an English-speaking country, the Australian government has looked to India to keep the housing Ponzi going at all costs. The current government recently signed 2 huge deals with India, both of which primarily benefit India. The first one was called the Australia-India Migration and Mobility Partnership Agreement. It includes some mind-boggling provisions. Let me give you some examples. 5-year student visas with no caps on the number of Indians that can study in Australia. Indian graduates of Australian tertiary institutions on a student visa can apply to work without visa sponsorship for up to 8 years. 3-month visitor visas available to Indians for family or business purposes, but no caps on numbers. How can there be no caps on immigration numbers, taking into consideration dire economic conditions? Well, if you look at this video of a stadium full of people in Sydney welcoming Indian Prime Minister Modi, where the Australian PM Anthony Albanese seems quite starstruck, perhaps a clearer picture starts to emerge. The Australian government also signed another agreement called the Mechanism for Mutual Recognition of Qualifications, which means Australia must treat Indian vocational and university qualifications as equivalent to Australian qualifications when it comes to applying for higher education. Sorry, but that is nonsense. In what world should a supposedly world-class export of education consider degrees from India, which is a known hotspot for fraudulent education? This Bloomberg report effectively labels thousands of degrees from India worthless due to rampant fraud. These deals create an open door for Indians to move to Australia, potentially bringing millions over the coming decades due to India's high unemployment and Australia's better quality of life. And when that happens, people who are already struggling with wage growth compete with desperate Indians who generally are willing to work for even less. And that's disregarding the competition for housing and other services. Many experts argue that these deals undermine Australia's sovereignty by imposing no limits on Indian immigration, an advantage rarely extended to other countries. But the rorting of the system goes much further than these silly deals. And to explore that, here's a question that needs to be asked. Why do all these students need to work? No, seriously. Australian universities are extremely expensive. Living in Australia is extremely expensive. Logically, you would expect only wealthy students to come here to study under such conditions. If there were genuine students, that is. Yet, that doesn't seem to be what's happening. In Australia, you're required to have around $30,000 in your bank account to prove you can support yourself while you're a student. You only have to show this once. So, students get a loan while overseas, get the sum transferred to their accounts, and then work in Australia to pay this off. A Navitas survey highlights this well. For students from South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, quality of education ranked last or second to last, while access to post-study work rights and opportunities to work while studying topped the list. And where there are fake students, there are a lot of fake schools. Of Australia's nearly 1 million international students, over 270,000 are enrolled in vocational programs, and another 79,000 are studying English. Sounds legit, right? Except the reality is that many of these so-called educational institutions are less school and more visa factory. Take the vocational education sector, for example. The most popular courses? Management and Commerce in New South Wales and Victoria. Not at universities, mind you, but at VET programs where the educational content is about as valuable as the trivia on a cereal box. Attenders? Optional. Career prospects? Unless you dream of managing a petrol station, let's just say it's slim to none. And then there are the ghost colleges. These institutions barely exist. They're nothing more than empty classrooms with a few bored staff members scrolling on their computers. The real business here is in education. It's selling backdoor immigration and work rights to international students. Take a look at this building full of these ghost colleges. You'd think they used a random name generator to come up with these. Sydney City College of Management? Come on now. The government recently cracked down, shutting down 150 ghost colleges and issuing warnings to 140 more. Turns out, many of these colleges aren't even run by educators. Some are co-owned by visa agents from places like Punjab, India, who promise students that they can skip class, work full-time, and still get their residency. One student openly admitted to a newspaper, "I came to Australia 2 years ago after being assured that I could work 5 days a week while my attendance and course would be taken care of. The only problem? The government shut down his ghost college, and now he has no idea what to do." The system is practically built for this exploitation. Some students work in construction all day instead of attending English classes, while colleges manage their attendance records and churn out fake certificates. One former staff member at a ghost college revealed they had 600 students enrolled but could barely get even one to show up for class. So why does this happen? Simple. The colleges make a fortune in fees, migrant agents rake in commissions, and the students get what they came for: work rights and a pathway to permanent residency. Everyone wins, except the Australian public, which is left footing the bill for an overwhelmed system. The Australian Bureau of Statistics proudly reports that international students contribute a whopping $50 billion to our economy, calling it an education export. Turns out, a quarter of that figure, around $13 billion, is actually money these students earn while working in Australia. Not exactly an export when it's earned here, is it? It's like selling your own sandwich and calling it a trade surplus. So in reality, this isn't as valuable an export as the propagandists claim. Funny enough, a lot of that money does not stay in Australia either. Many of these students send it straight back home. In 2023 alone, almost $10 billion left Australia in remittances, while only $2 billion came in. That's a net outflow of almost $8 billion. In other words, the so-called education export is leaking money like a sieve. And it doesn't stop there. Universities and colleges pay hefty commissions to overseas agents to recruit these students. These payments, along with remittances, aren't counted in the education export figures, which means the already exaggerated $50 billion claim is even more inflated than it looks. If education were truly a $50 billion export, you would expect to see at least that much flowing into the country. Instead, we see billions leaving. And the kicker? Digital remittance platforms are booming, making it easier and cheaper than ever for students to send money home. Now, it would be great if these students were the world's best and brightest, right? Future Einsteins, groundbreaking researchers, or African-American entrepreneurs like Elon Musk. There have been no OpenAIs or SpaceXs coming out of Australia. Take Nepal, for example. With a GDP per capita of around $1,300, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. Yet, it's somehow Australia's third largest source of international students. How? Well, it turns out the education part is just a side hustle. The real draw is access to work visas, and for postgraduate students, the bonus of bringing along a spouse who can work full-time. In Nepal, this has become a full-fledged industry. There are networks, agents, and entire operations designed to send students to Australia, not for degrees, but for jobs. The money these students generate doesn't trickle down to benefit Australians. Universities funnel the cash into hiring high citation researchers, people who don't even teach, to boost their global rankings. Think about it. International student fees for Accounting 101 are paying for a famed researcher who'll never step foot in a lecture hall. And the big winners? Australia's vice-chancellors, who pocket bonuses when their rankings improve. Speaking of, these people are paid ridiculous sums of money. For instance, in 2023, the University of Melbourne's Vice-Chancellor, Duncan Maskell, earned over $1.4 million, even after a $60,000 reduction from the previous year. Similarly, the University of Sydney's Vice-Chancellor, Mark Scott, received a $75,000 pay increase, bringing his total earnings to over $1.17 million. In contrast, as of July 2024, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's salary was only $600,000. And yet, universities don't appear to be making money. Despite their tax-exempt status and the billions they rake in from international student fees, many universities are still in the red. But don't worry, the university lobby has a snappy defense. International education is great for Australia. Great for whom exactly? Certainly not the Australian students paying more for less, or the public trying to find an affordable place to live. Dear viewer, if you're thinking that your vote could fix this mess, assuming you're watching from Australia, let me stop you right there. You'll be dead wrong. The university lobby isn't the only group cashing in on Australia's immigration Ponzi scheme. Take this gem. 2 years ago, then Immigration Minister Andrew Giles headlined a private Victorian Labor Party fundraiser. The event, organised by none other than Jasvinder Sidhu, a controversial Labor figure. The prize of admission? A cool $1,000 per head, mostly paid by Indian migration agents looking to buy access to Giles. And what did they get for their money? A cozy chat about visa delays and how difficult it was to deal with the immigration system. According to Facebook posts by attendees, Giles was apparently all ears, admitting that the system wasn't working and promising many changes to make it easier. The result? Giles boasted in early 2023 that 5.4 million visas had been approved since Labor took office, and the backlog had been slashed from 1 million to just under 600,000. That's right, everybody. Australia's immigration doors were thrown wide open, all while Labor patted themselves on the back for streamlining the system. But don't think this is a Labor exclusive phenomenon. Oh no, the coalition, or the opposition for international viewers, has been playing the same game. Education spokesperson Sarah Henderson recently headlined an event with migration agents and private colleges promoting ways for international students to extend their stays. Meanwhile, opposition leader Peter Dutton has been waxing lyrical about more Indian immigration, even supporting Labor's open border migration pacts with India in 2023. Pete, mate, those deals have no caps for international students. Seriously, open your eyes. When it comes to immigration, it's not about what's best for Australians. It's about who can raise the most cash, keep the right lobbyists happy, and secure votes from migrant-heavy electorates. Labor red, Liberal blue, it's all the same game, and we're the ones paying the price. Speaking of paying the price, let's talk about some of the policies these lobbyist dinners have influenced, like parent visas, for instance. The Albanese government almost doubled the number of visas issued in 2023, from 4,500 to 8,500. And if certain Indian community leaders get their way, those numbers will skyrocket even further. Parent visas are some of the most expensive immigration policies we have. According to the Productivity Commission, each parent visa costs Australian taxpayer between $335,000 and $410,000 over the visa holder's lifetime. That's for healthcare, aged care, and other social services. In total, the 2015-16 intake alone was estimated to cost the taxpayer almost $3 billion while generating only $345 million in visa fees. And yet, the lobbying continues. Community leaders argue these visas aren't issued fast enough, ignoring the massive strain they place in Australia's welfare state. Remember when politicians claimed immigration would help offset our aging population? Yeah, parent visas do the exact opposite. They directly add to the problem. Now, despite the overcrowding, housing shortages, and economic stress, you'd think all these migrants and students would create jobs. Spoiler alert, they haven't. The stark truth is that much of the job creation in recent years has been funneled into supporting the immigration and welfare Ponzi scheme itself, with the NDIS playing a starring role. Every 10 weeks, the nation reportedly needs 1,200 nurses, 420 doctors, 75 dentists, 70 firefighters, and more just to keep up with the population growth driven by immigration. But here's the kicker. Outside of healthcare, social assistance, and immigration-linked industries, job creation is effectively non-existent. Even the jobs being created are primarily centered around industries like yoga instructors, migration agents, and administrative support, many of which serve the ever-growing demands of programs like the NDIS. This massive scheme, originally envisioned as a lifeline for people with disabilities, has ballooned into a $42 billion behemoth, with projected costs climbing to over $100 billion annually by 2034. And while that's shocking enough, the NDIS also seems to have wandered into some interesting territory. For a brief moment, the NDIS, Australia's taxpayer-funded disability scheme, was footing the bill for what can only be described as romantic therapy. That's right, sex work was covered under the scheme thanks to a 2020 federal court ruling that deemed it reasonable and necessary. So, jokes on you if you can't pull on a night out, because there are some people getting professional services courtesy of the Australian taxpayer. However, the government has since stepped in to draw the line, banning sex work from being funded. Their reasoning was that it was not a sustainable proposition. No kidding. Though considering how much of the NDIS budget gets siphoned into questionable corners like steam rooms and group trips to Japan, it's fair to wonder if this was really where the axe needed to fall. The disability sector, of course, is outraged, claiming this ban robs participants of free choice. One advocate even quipped that the government is now effectively deciding who can have sex. I'm sorry, but what? Imagine that. Australia, where you can't find a rental, can barely afford groceries, but we were briefly debating whether the government could play matchmaker. The absurdity of this system knows no bounds. The NDIS, once a noble idea, is now a runaway train that's only adding to Australia's economic woes. It's a scheme propped up by immigration-driven growth, creating jobs that serve the system itself, rather than addressing deeper economic stagnation. Immigration is the lifeblood of Australia's housing market, and sprawling schemes like the NDIS artificially keeping the economy from tipping into recession. Every new migrant represents another household in need, another worker in an overstretched system, and another statistic propping up a fragile facade of economic growth. But this isn't real prosperity, it's a treadmill of dependency. The country's answer to every economic strain has been to pile on more people, more demand, and more short-term fixes. Housing prices soar, rents skyrocket, and welfare systems balloon, all in a desperate bid to keep the numbers looking good on paper. Beneath the surface, though, productivity is stagnant, wages are stalling, and per capita living standards are crumbling. And here's the truth. The billions pouring into housing, immigration, and the NDIS aren't building a sustainable economy. They're propping up what may be the world's biggest Ponzi scheme, one that relies on an endless influx of people to keep the illusion alive. Each new addition stretches the system thinner, postponing the inevitable collapse. This is not sustainable growth. It's a delicate balancing act, one gust of wind away from collapse. Australia is chasing fleeting gains, a quick fix here, a band-aid there, all while ignoring the structural issues pulling it under. And when this Ponzi scheme finally unravels, as it inevitably will, The nation may find itself standing on a foundation of sand, the tides of economic reality washing everything away. Australia isn't building a brighter future. It's sprinting in place, hoping the ground doesn't crumble beneath its feet. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. A huge thank you to all my supporters on Patreon, whose support makes this content possible. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can join the YouTube membership by hitting the join button or head to the Patreon link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.